Hello everybody and welcome to So I Play Games. I'm your host Scott, and today I want to talk about a game called Trials of Mana. Trials of Mana is a real-time action-adventure RPG that was developed and published by Square Enix. In the beginning, you have 6 characters to choose from, 3 of which you can choose to be in your party, with 1 being the main character that the story will start off with and have a little more focus on in the beginning. Each character comes with their own unique set of skills and benefits to suit how you want to play, whether that be a healer, spellcaster, a DPS, or a brute who can take all the damage for your team. You can mix and match whoever you want, but once you've chosen your 3, they're locked in and you won't be able to play as any of the other characters unless you start a new game. Who you choose will affect the cutscenes, dialogue, and the end of the game. There are 3 different final dungeons and there are 3 different final bosses based on who you choose. Trials of Mana starts off with your main character's origin story, which eventually leads to meeting Fairy, who is a fairy, and she explains that you have to bring her to the Priest of Light because something has happened to the Sanctuary of Mana. As you make your way to the Priest of Light, you end up meeting the 2 other members you chose along the way. As you meet them, you're given the opportunity to go through the introduction of their origin story too. No matter who you choose, every character ends up on the same path that leads them to the Priest of Light. Once your party meets the Priest of Light, him along with Fairy tell of the mana tree withering away along with all mana in the world being nearly depleted. They explain that if mana depletes completely, the Benevodons, powerful creatures, will be released on the world. They continue to say that you need to reclaim the Sword of Mana from the Sanctuary of Mana and awaken the Goddess of Mana to restore peace. But because the mana is almost non-existent, they can't open a portal to get there. In order to gather enough power to do so, they explain that your party must gather the power of the elements near the 8 mana stones. This is where Trials of Mana's adventure truly begins, with your party, accompanied by Fairy, set out to find the mana stones and reclaim the Sword of Mana. Trials of Mana drops you into its vibrant world almost instantly. Every city, town, forest, cave, and everything in between is delightfully detailed and pleasantly colorful, with its anime-like art style. One thing I have to admit before diving too deep into this is that I've never played the original Secret of Mana or Seiken Densetsu 3. I've done some research to have a reference, and from what I've seen and read, Trials of Mana is one of the more faithful remakes. Even with my lack of experience, seeing how well each area was brought into the 3D world was beyond impressive. I can understand the excitement and love the fans have for this. The characters look absolutely fantastic, and their designs are expanded upon even more when classes are unlocked later on. Unfortunately, enemies and NPCs are not as lucky. I'll start with saying that there are quite a few enemy types, and they vary from unmistakably adorable to cartoon creepy, but I did notice a lot of recycled designs and reskins throughout my playthrough. It's a lot more noticeable with the NPCs. The majority of them are the same model, just with different colored shirts and pants. I don't know if this is because of how faithful they wanted to be to the original, but for me it did take away from the towns feeling actually populated, especially when I'd run into the same person with a different color shirt 4 or 5 times in one town. I honestly don't think I would have noticed as much just playing through, but it's encouraged to talk to every NPC to potentially unlock skills through conversations with them. Outside of the towns though, exploring each area was more thought out and exciting. Trials of Mana has an open but linear way of letting you run around, and they did it very well. It allowed for enough freedom to actually explore, appreciate the level design, look for hidden chests and other secrets while keeping the game moving forward. It isn't until a little later when other forms of travel are found that everything really opens up. When it comes to level progression and overall growth, Trials of Mana has a lot of the usual JRPG formula, but at the same time brings something new to the table that isn't so common, that being the customization. It is by far one of the more standout features. Leveling up gives you training points to put towards strength, stamina, luck, spirit, or intelligence, all of which unlocks skills, spells, passives, and other stat boosts mattering on how much you invest into them. When it comes to classes, there are 4 tiers, but for the main playthrough you only have to worry about the first 3. Each class has 2 choices, light or dark, and they affect each character very differently. This can range from being a straight DPS to hammer home damage, a tank to soak up damage, a healer, a crowd control debuff caster, and so much more. Mix that in with where you invest your stats as you level up and passives you can equip, and you're given a wide scale of options for how your character's build can be. Equipment on the other hand is your run-of-the-mill just like most JRPGs. Each character has their own weapon, armor, and accessory slots to be upgraded through the journey as needed. Which leads me to the combat that is surprisingly simple and clean. You start off with limited combos and class strikes that will open up as you level and unlock classes, along with other skills, spells, and so on that unlock with every tier of class that's unlocked. Class strikes are special attacks specific to the class chosen for your character, and it uses a certain amount of the class strike gauge mattering on the skill used. The class strike gauge is replenished by landing combos on enemies, while spells and other skills use MP that are replenished by items. The enemies felt creative and fun, with some having shields that needed to be broken by charge attacks, some that needed to be knocked out of the air with aerial combos, or some even evolving mid-fight into a tougher enemy. I can't say I didn't enjoy it all in the beginning, but eventually some glaring issues did start to show. Like the AI for party members. They're competent enough for smaller and earlier fights, but are less reliable when it comes to bosses and more complicated enemies. You're able to switch between characters to try to make up for this, but ultimately it's almost unavoidable. Even with being able to customize their behavior, it does help for their survivability and controlling how they act in most fights, but overall it's still flawed when it comes to relying on them to avoid AoE attacks or focusing their attacks on an enemy mechanic that's about to wipe the whole party. Which leads me to the more obvious issue. Trials of Mana is very repetitive. With combat being one of the bigger selling points and what seems to be what they focused on heavily, you spend a lot of time fighting. And because you don't get your higher tier classes or access to more variety of skills and combos till much later, the constant fighting gets stale and repetitive. On top of the enemies being recycled and reskinned a lot too. So mixing in seeing the same enemies over and over with a lack of options outside of using the same combo time and time again, the excitement for fighting enemies becomes lackluster and feels more like a chore. It wasn't until I locked the third tier of classes for all my party members that I felt like my options opened up more, but by then it was nearly the end and it still didn't make up for the repetition. I even played on hard mode in hopes to keep things interesting, but even on hard the game was barely a challenge. I can think of one or two bosses that were fun and actually had me work to defeat them. Enemies on the other hand just felt like damage sponges. Something I can give praise to is the sound design and music for Trials of Mana. I played with my headphones on and noticed right away how great not only the soundtrack was, but the actual combat and environmental sounds. The realism of wind blowing and fire crackling nearby, changing from one ear to the other as I ran around, was an attention to detail I can always appreciate. And like I mentioned before, the soundtrack is easily one of the best parts of the entire game. Each area had its own unique track to fit the tone and aesthetic, along with the upbeat, exciting music that chimes in during more tense moments and fights. I found myself practically dancing along with every track. An added benefit is being able to toggle between the original soundtrack and the new remixed version. I wish I could say the same about the voice acting. Though not all are out of place, and I don't blame the voice actors themselves either, it felt more like there wasn't enough direction given to the actors themselves and the characters' voices not exactly matching their appearance. If you ever feel like taking a break from the story, there are a few things you can take on, starting off with the passive abilities otherwise known as chain abilities. Soon after talking to the Priest of Light, you gain the ability to learn new ones through conversations with certain NPCs. As tedious as it may be to talk to every NPC you see, it is worth going out of your way for, especially to help when experimenting with different builds. If that doesn't do it for you, there are little cactuses spread throughout every area that, once enough are collected, help with getting discounts at shops, double to triple XP, and so much more. The little cactuses were a lifesaver when it came to upgrading equipment near end game, considering the prices go up significantly. If that's not for you, there are magic pots in every inn you visit that can be leveled up with every use. This can be extremely useful for getting better items, equipment, and weapons, especially if you can max its level out. Quite a few of the weapons and equipment I used came from the magic pot, so I highly recommend keeping up on it if you can. By the time I finished Trials of Mana, I had just under 40 hours clocked in. I found myself underwhelmed but understanding at the same time. The story was nothing to run on about. It was the typical stop the end of the world kind of plot, and it doesn't really grow outside of that. The origin of each character was probably the best part for me when it came to keeping my interest in what was going to happen next. But even those didn't dive very deep into anything too complex. Even more so, the origin of the other party members stopped being relevant out of nowhere at a certain point in the game, and you don't figure out what happens to them until you beat the game and progress a little into the post-game. But like I said, I do understand to an extent. Back in the day, this was more than passable for a story, and again the combat was the big sell that was supposed to be what kept everyone playing. With Trials of Mana being as faithful to the original it could be, there wasn't much that could be done about it. Any alteration or addition to the story would have most definitely come with consequences or backlash of some kind from the community. Long story short, I praise how Square kept Trials of Mana as a faithful remake. Sadly, it doesn't stand up to the modern game's complex and convoluted stories these days, so anyone new to the series may not appreciate it for what it really is. Overall, I did have fun playing through Trials of Mana. The customization for each character is quite possibly the best feature and the most fun to be had when testing out different builds. And like I mentioned before, when getting into the higher tier of classes, combat does open up with more variety to help with keeping things interesting. Unfortunately, I did fall under the spell of being spoiled by more recent games having better storytelling, voice acting, companion AI, and overall gameplay. It's not a bad game by any means, but when stacked beside other JRPGs, it pales in comparison. If you can look past the repetitiveness of combat, the poor voice acting direction, the lack of extra content or post-game content, and prefer a story that's simple and easy to follow with little to no challenge, then Trials of Mana is perfect for exactly that. And there you have it, my opinion on Trials of Mana. Thank you for watching. If you liked this and want to see more, make sure to check out my last video on Kingdom Hearts 3 and click that subscribe button. If you want to see more of me, then feel free to join my streams here on YouTube or Twitch on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I stream the games we'll be covering here. Links will be in the description. Thanks again, and I hope to see you soon.